interested about? Sorry. So what we're interested about is the flow of yield stress fluid in a highly disordered medium. And so we model this with a percolation network, right, with a porous medium with cut links in it, cut pore throats, basically. So this can have applications in particular, for example, in the industrial settings. For example, when you inject foam, which is a yield stress fluid, you want to know how it will flow inside your soil, which can be very disordered. And also it can be useful if you perform enhanced oil recovery, right? So you inject complex fluid inside the soil to better recover oil by pushing it from the least resistant path that it's trapped in. So these are some of the applications. It could be useful to know how complex fluids flow in a highly disordered porous medium. So to model this phenomena, we use a very simple representation of a porous medium. It's a pore network model. It's a network where the nodes are the wider region in the pore space here, and the links are the constrictions between them. So it's a heterogeneous network because the links, which are assumed to be cylindrical, they are radii distributed randomly with a uniform distribution around the non-zero mean value. In our work, we have decided to impose the pressure at the boundaries of our system, and also at each node of the network, we impose the mass conservation, which is exactly similar to solving Kirchhoff equations in random resistor networks. So what's a yield stress fluid? It's a fluid for which the shear stress, when it's above a critical value called the yield stress, the fluid behaves as a liquid. It's allowed to deform. Otherwise, the fluid behaves as a solid, which equivalently, its viscosity becomes infinite. If we compute for a specific type of yield stress fluid, which is a Bingham fluid, where the shear stress is linear with the shear rate is linear with the shear stress. And if you compute this in a cylinder of radius r in length L, you can have an analytical expression in red here. You can see the profile of this function, which gives the relationship between the flow rate and the pressure drop in the cylinder. And you have a nonlinear term here, and also the appearance of a pressure threshold denoted tau here, for which when the absolute value of the pressure drop is less than this pressure threshold, then the flow rate of the fluid inside the cylinder becomes 0. And this is because of the appearance of the yield stress, which is not present for Newtonian fluids, which start to flow as long as there is a non-zero pressure difference. So it is more convenient for us numerically to use a simpler linear bypass profile, which is represented here in green, which ignores this nonlinear part that is complicated to work with for the original flow rate profile, but that still conserves the right scaling laws for higher pressure drops, and also conserves the
let's continue.
Yeah, which conserves, the correct pressure thresholds. So basically what we do is we introduce a parameter P, which is the fraction of scaled links in the network. So we take a regular network, a square lattice with 4 neighbors for each node. We cut a fraction P of its links. We solve the flow equation by imposing the pressure, by imposing a pressure drop inside the system. And we see how it affects quantities that we're interested in, for example, the flow rate and the effective permeability and such.
Can I ask just one thing? You take a 2D model.
Yes.
But you still take 4 links per node, which probably is more characteristic of the 3D situation or not?
We assume a square lattice, but it's true that if you affect the connectivity, it can have other effects. And yeah, I guess I guess maybe
Well,
probably.
I mean, if you randomly tile 2D, you get always 3 lines touching. If you randomly fill 3D, you get 4 lines touching. But that's why I thought that you have four links to a pore, to a cavity.
Yeah, to be honest, in the code we use a super lattice, but it's not. But it's true that part of my project as a PhD student will be to extend these results to 3D.
Okay.
And with a heterogeneous connectivity for links for inside the network. But now we work
Sorry,
with 2D.
just go ahead.
we work with 2D. So here what it looks like. Okay. When we solve the flow equations, so for a given pressure drop, you have lots of paths flowing. Here the color represents the magnitude of the flow field. In white, you have the non-flowing yield stress, and in gray, you have the cut links in the network. So if we decrease the pressure drop imposed at the boundaries, we have that less and less paths start flowing. This is because the pressure thresholds associated to these paths become superior to the imposed pressure drop. So they start solidifying because you don't have a pressure drop sufficient for the yield stress to start flowing there. And there is a specific order in which these paths start solidifying, which depends on the disorder of the medium we're talking about.
Sorry, I have to get another question.
Yeah.
So you imposed a pressure difference in the boundaries, not a flow rate, but in general, is it guaranteed to give you a steady state? I can imagine that in some cases, for instance, if you impose the flow rate, it might even be oscillatory.
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
But what we find is that, yeah, our algorithm converges to a solution. It seems physical.
But there it's all steady. You're solving just steady state. So if it actually opens up, it will stay open.
If you impose a pressure, yes. If you impose a flow, you can imagine that then when it's percolating, the pressure drops, it closes, it drops, and it rises again, and so you might have an oscillatory flow. But I mean, that must be known, not to me, of course.
And I think my advisor has also worked with the imposed flow rate with Andreas actually, and yeah, they find the stationary solution.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's ever seen this kind of oscillations.
But you agree that it could be?
Absolutely, absolutely.
It has to be because you're building up pressure until you get the pressure breakthrough, right?
So if you decrease sufficiently the pressure drop, you see that there is only one path that flows, and this is an important part because it defines the critical pressure threshold. It is the minimum pressure drop that you must apply to the system for non-zero flow to appear. So in our work, we have distinguished two problems. One, characterize the scaling of this critical pressure threshold, which the remarkable thing is that it has a closed form expression here. It is the minimum among all possible paths in the network of the sum of the pressure threshold taken by these paths. So we want to find the scaling of that as we cut more and more links in the network. And also we want to study the flow regime, so the relationship between the flow rate and the pressure drop, again, as we cut links in the network. So I'll start with the first part about critical pressure threshold, which can be of interest because it answers the question, when does the fluid start to flow? Imagine you have a pollutant that you can model as a yield stress fluid. You want to know when it will start to flow inside a porous medium, for example. So I will start by recalling some results. So
I'm terrible, but can I ask something again? What is the distribution of the individual thresholds? Because if it's Gaussian, then sure you get an answer. If it has a fat tail, there may not even be an answer larger than 0.
Yeah, I didn't mention that very explicitly. So I'll just go back a few slides. Okay, so I mentioned the radii are distributed randomly with a uniform distribution, with not including zero. It's everything above 0. So the pressure threshold is its inverse. So it's a power law with a cutoff, basically. for both low and high values.
The answer will depend on the distribution.
Yes, exactly. Because if you distribute the radii with a Gaussian distribution, you have that the pressure thresholds can go to infinity, and so you have lots of other results.
But the time C is constant for everyone, and the lengths, are they also the same?
Yes, yes. The length of in the network are supposed equivalent in all the network, and tau C too. Yeah. So when we cut a very few.
Okay, I have a quick question here.
Yeah.
So when it's flowing, you have a distribution of the yield stress, right, in the network. But when it's flowing, is the pressure drop across all the links in one of the red lines there, for instance? Is it the same?
If I understand correctly, you want to know if the pressure drop is the same in all the links in the network?
Yeah, like once it starts to flow, and then you have like a path, like one of the red ones there. The pressure drop per link, is it the same in all the links in this path?
No, it's heterogeneous because it depends on precisely on the radius of each link and all the paths present.
Okay, so you have heterogeneity both in the yield stress values and in the radius of the links.
Yeah. Sorry?
You have heterogeneity both in the yield stress and no, the yield stress, is it constant?
Yes, it is a constant.
Okay, so the heterogeneity is only like the
radius. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So when you cut very few links in a network, the paths are directed because they minimize the pressure threshold second by this path. But as you cut more and more links in the network, your optimal first path appearing will have to take turns in order to avoid the cut links, and you will see overhangs as you remove the best possible path. And especially at the percolation transition, when you cut roughly half of the links in the network. Again, this depends on the connectivity in the network, because here we use a square lattice, so it's 1/2, but it could be another value. Then at the percolation transition, you can define the correlation length, which is the size of the largest cluster of the cut links in the network. And this correlation length diverges with an exponent nu, which for 2D square lattices is 4/3. And at this percolation transition, you only have a few paths left. And so you expect the tortuosity of your first path appearing to increase. It has been shown that when there are no cut links in the network, finding this critical pressure threshold is exactly equivalent to finding the ground state energy of a polymer in a random lattice. So suppose you have a lattice occupying each bond takes up the energy, and having a polymer occupy bonds in this network, each polymer configuration has an energy. And so you want to find the minimum of the energy of this configuration. And it's exactly like finding the optimal path in our problem. Which means that we already know that the fluctuations of energy, here energy is the same as the critical pressure threshold. It's exactly the same. It scales as the length of the polymer, sorry, with an I shouldn't touch the screen, with an exponent 2/3. So Carter and Balens have studied this for directed paths, and they showed that this scaling holds for a large range of fraction of scaled links in the network. But at the percolation threshold, what you have is that you have so few paths available to choose from that basically finding the optimal path is almost equivalent to one-dimensional random walk. And so you expect this linear term for the fluctuations with the size of the system. And Stella, Van der Zand, and Zeno, a few years later, they extended this to non-directed paths, but because of the computational capabilities of their time, they only could perform simulations for very thin systems. So they found an exponent very close to 2.04 in their paper, which is one you find for very confined random walks. So what we do is that we argue that the scaling of this critical pressure threshold is dominated by the scaling of the chemical length. I will explain briefly what that means. The chemical length, suppose you have 2 points in a percolation network, A and B. They are separated by a distance L, a Euclidean distance. And you want to know inside this percolation network, what are the minimal steps I can make to go from A to B. So it's the shortest path in the percolation network. And so we've made a few simulations of the critical pressure threshold by computing Dijkstra's algorithm, by using a Dijkstra's algorithm for multiple sizes of the system that increase as we should expect. And there is an exponent, 0.15, that we will see is almost very equal to the one for the chemical length. So it is known that the scaling of the chemical distance follows this relation with here the fractal dimension of the optimal path that depends on the geometry of your network, and with this universal function G that should not depend on the size of the system because it depends on a dimensionless number. It is the size of the system divided by the correlation length. And so with this scaling relation, we can find the scaling of the chemical distance near the percolation threshold. And it's supposed to diverge with an exponent beta that only depends on the exponent for the correlation length and the fractal dimension of the first flowing path. And it's roughly equal to 0.17, which is very close to what we have. And here, if we plot this universal function, we have that our data collapses very with a good result, and we still have this 0.15 exponent. And when you're very close to PC, you have this plateau that appears, and this is because we arrive at the percolation threshold. So at the percolation threshold, what we have is that the critical pressure threshold, which scales as the length of the polymer, scales like the size of the system exponent the fractal dimension of the first flowing path, which is something that has already been measured for a while. So now we wanted to compute the fluctuations. So what we did was measure the percolation threshold for each network, then compute the optimal path, and we average over 300 realizations. And as expected, we see that the scaling is the same for a wide range of killed links in the network, but very close to the percolation threshold, near above this dashed line. We see that the exponent for the fluctuations jumps with an exponent 2.02. And we want to be able to explain this. So what we did first was at the percolation threshold, compare the fluctuations of energy with the fluctuations of the length of the optimal path. And we see that they have exactly the same scaling. So we know that, and as it was shown, that the fluctuations of energy are dominated by the fluctuations of length. And we can explain that with a simple argument. Recall Cardar's argument that at the percolation threshold, you only have a one-dimensional random walk because you don't have many paths to choose from. So we assume that the critical pressure threshold can be written as a 1D random walk, but now with both the pressure thresholds taken as random variables, but also the number of steps of this random walk. And we can simply compute the second moment of this random walk, and we see that it's the sum of two terms, one proportional to the average length of the polymer, and one proportional to the length fluctuations. And as we've seen, this term scales like the average length squared. So it's So it's normal that you see that the fluctuations of energy are dominated by the fluctuations of length. And so from this, we can deduce that the fluctuations of energy, which again are the fluctuations of the critical pressure threshold, they scale with this exponent here, which is roughly equal to 2.26. So what we have done in this first part is find the mean and the variance of the critical pressure threshold and how it scales with the system size. And we see that it's entirely determined by the fractal dimension of the optimal path at the percolation threshold. And below it is dominated by the scaling of the chemical length. So now I will go on to the second part, in which we are interested in more than when there are more than one path flowing. So when you cut no leaks in the network, you have three flow regimes appearing. You have the first one here that appears when you are slightly above the critical pressure threshold. So again, you have only one path flowing, and since the flow rate, the local flow rate is linear, it is expected that the flow rate is also linear with a difference between the pressure drop and the critical pressure threshold. Also, when you're very far from the critical pressure threshold, here, you recover Darcy's law, because all possible paths start flowing, and so you recover basically the Newtonian regime. But in between these two regimes, you have a nonlinear regime with this exponent gamma roughly equal to 2. And this is because of an interplay between the increase in permeability as new paths start flowing and the fact that when the number of paths flowing is constant, the flow rate is linear with the increase in pressure drop. So basically, when there are no paths opening, the flow rate is linear. But then, for each path flowing, you have an increase in the permeability of the medium. And if we assume that this increase is linear, then it is expected that the flow rate becomes quadratic with the increase in pressure drop. And this has been seen in lots of contents, and as early as the works of Lennerman and Roux on random resistor network. It's been seen for lattice Boltzmann simulations also. Now,
excuse me, just a quick question. So the region 1 there, is it always just a single path?
Actually, I simplified a bit. It's the first flowing path, but also a few very short paths that don't contribute a lot to the increase in permeability. Yeah, like that when the second, we don't exactly know when the second regime starts appearing, but it's true that when you're, for example, here, you can have a few different paths flowing. You don't see, but still, the increase in permeability is negligible.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Thanks. Possibly related question.
Yes.
Is it possible for paths to split or merge at all, or is that at measure zero?
Yeah, yes. Because otherwise that would be independent and it would be just capillary.
Well, independent. They can't cross otherwise, so they're not really independent.
Yeah, no, it's true that no, but for in capillary bundle models, they do not cross, and you have lots of stuff about that. But here, yes, they can merge and then they can split.
Okay.
Which is why it makes it so hard to predict analytically permeability, conductance for this kind of network. Yes.
You said you can have several paths there, but do you have a single critical link always in region 1 when you're getting down to the?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, so you can always have two separate paths through the whole network.
Yes, exactly. Mm. I mean, if you have a more pathological distribution for the pressure threshold, you could imagine that configuration where almost all the first probing path must pass through this link.
Yeah.
But But in general, in our case, at least, what when we're working with a very weak disorder, I mean, for the pressure threshold, then no, there is no. There could two flowing paths can appear independent, not crossing, basically. So what we did was reproduce these effects, but while cutting more and more links in the network. And we introduced for convenience a parameter epsilon here, which defined with this formula. It basically tells us how far we are from the critical pressure gradient. So if epsilon is very large, you have all possible paths flowing, and if epsilon is very low, you have only one path flowing or very few paths flowing. And so what we see is that when the fraction of Kelvin links in the network is very close to 0, you recover this second nonlinear regime with a quadratic exponent. But as you increase the number of Kelvin links, you have that it gradually disappears. And at the percolation threshold, unless you know it's there, it's basically invisible. And we interpret this as the fact that at the percolation threshold, you have so few paths available that the gain in permeability isn't significant enough to have a second nonlinear regime to appear.
Sorry, what was E here again? Is that the
E
probability?
is the fraction of Kelvin links. When it's here, it's 0. And as you go in this direction, it increases up to roughly 1/2 when it's there. So we can identify the two extreme regimes as before. When the flow rate is very close to 0, again, we have only one path flowing. And we can find roughly an approximate for an analytical solution for the flow rate. And it's entirely determined by the fractal dimension of the first flowing path. And when you see the other extreme regime where all possible paths are flowing, you have that the ratio Q over epsilon doesn't depend on the system size, apparently, because you don't see a clear correlation between the size of the system and the value of the plateau that is attained. And this is expected because as you get very far from the critical pressure threshold, the ratio Q over epsilon becomes roughly equal to the Q over the gradient of pressure in the system. So you recover the permeability, which becomes a constant when all possible paths are flowing. So we were interested in, are there any other quantities that we could find that are affected at the percolation threshold, and what are the scaling? And we have studied two. The effective permeability and the apparent pressure threshold. So I won't go very much into the details for these two quantities. I will just say that the apparent pressure threshold has a nice geometrical interpretation. When it is the pressure threshold you would get if you interpolate the slope for the flow rate and until you hit the pressure axis here. It is also called the pseudo-critical pressure threshold because it can be the one used in experiments when you don't know exactly the shape of your porous medium, but it is not the actual value of the critical pressure threshold when the flow starts to appear, which is much less easily available in experiments. So we have computed first the effective permeability. We see that at the low flow rate regime, it scales as the inverse of the length of the system times with an exponent of the fractal dimension again. And for the high flow rate regime, you have this exponent T over nu, which is very well known which is a very well known exponent for the conductivity of a random resistor network at the percolation threshold. It appears because the effective permeability itself is critical at this point. and this exponent is roughly equal to -1. So you have a good fit with this scaling. And also for the apparent pressure threshold, you similarly have that scale with the chemical length at for the low flow rate regime, and also for the high flow rate, it scales with this exponent d tilde here. That is the average tortuosity of the transport path in a network. And this is we can find by doing simplified arguments why it's this, but I won't detail it here. If you want, we can talk about it later. But it is also a well-known exponent in the percolation community. So what we've seen is that at the high and low flow rate regime, everything is scaling like known percolation exponents, which is what we found interesting. And also, if we look at the fluctuations, the exact value of the exponent is less clear on these plots, but it seems to us that for both the effective permeability and the apparent pressure threshold, you have that the scaling of these fluctuations is roughly the square of the scaling of the mean values, which means that the self-averaging property no longer holds. I will explain. So, what's the self-averaging property? It is something that says that when you compute the ratio of the fluctuation divided by the mean value, as you increase the system size, it should go to 0 for non-pathological distribution. And what it means is that if this property holds, you can replace doing ensemble averages with lots of samples with just doing one simulation, but with increasing the system size. It is closely related to the Harris criterion. So what this means is that here, if the ratio of fluctuations divided by the mean value doesn't tend to 0 as we increase the system size, because they have the same scaling, that means that for such a strong disorder at the percolation threshold, we cannot substitute doing lots of samples and lots to have the good statistics for the quantities we're interested in, but we have to. I mean, we can't replace doing that by just increasing the system size, basically. This is a consequence of the scaling of what we've studied. So to summarize, we have seen that the critical pressure threshold for its mean and its variance are determined by the chemical length, and that at the percolation threshold, it is entirely described by the vast fractal dimension. We have seen that the flow regimes that we observe when we don't cut any links in the network, it disappears as we cut more and more links, and this is because you have less paths available to flow. And also, we have that at the percolation threshold, all quantities that we can be interested in, that we've studied, are determined, their scaling is determined by known percolation exponents. And also, because of that, because of this strong disorder at the percolation threshold, the self-averaging property no longer holds. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any questions? I see we have maybe one from Sanjana in Zoom.
Oh, sorry, that was just a clap react.
Oh, okay, yeah.
My bad.
I see. Okay, so any question?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. Go on, Marcel.
This the figure that you show, like the three regimes. So this, if the experiment was done with setting flow rate instead of pressure drop, would you expect the same type of behavior?
Well, I'm not sure, because when you impose the flow rate, and you look at how the stimulation, how the flow behaves, it's entirely different. First, there is no more this first regime, because all paths at the start of at the inlet are flowing, and they just merge as you advance in the porous medium. So I don't think you can really expect the same thing if you impose the flow rates. But I have not studied that in detail.
At least you see the last transition, I think. If I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, two questions. Okay, the first one is, imagine now you are keeping the flow rates constant, and you're not doing this in a square geometry, but you're doing this on a circle, so you're checking in the middle.
Yes.
And then it flows outwards, outwards, outwards. And then you're going to see three regimes, right? You're going to see the inner regime where everything, if your flow rate is high enough, everything is flowing, right?
Yes.
No blockage. And then you're going to have a ring with a transition regime, and then in the end you're going to end up with one channel up there. So and then by changing the flow rate, you're going to see the thickness of these rings change, right?
Yeah.
These radii. So it will be very interesting to do this experiment. Actually, it's much more easier to do this numerically. I mean, experimentally than numerically.
Ah.
And
I'm
because you need a
surprised
big system, right?
Yeah. I'm surprised it hasn't been done actually.
No, I don't know. I haven't seen it anywhere. And you know, I mean, squeezing ketchup through it's not so easy. But anyway, and my second question is, when you're using the Bingham model, you are making an approximation, as you say, you are replacing that little square part
Yes.
that comes from this actually being in a tube by something sharp. Yeah. Do you think in an experimental situation that one don't influence, because that is giving you an extra square, so it looks like the middle regime without being it?
I don't think it will affect, because the pressure thresholds are conserved, it will not affect the appearance of the first path.
No.
It should not affect when you have a high pressure drop, because it's the same scaling laws.
No, but if you turn on the square type behavior already in what should be the first linear regime, it wouldn't be linear anymore, because you know you're going to have all these thresholds.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it would not be linear.
Yeah. And then I have a little third equation, and that's just a speculation. I mean, you have this 1.22 exponent, and as I said, I mean, the people in Fortaleza in Brazil, they have been working a lot on that exponent. Those who see it in this, they call it the watershed exponent. You know, you have, like America, it hasn't sunk yet. You know, you have a watershed there between the things flowing to the west and to the east. And if you look at that path, that exponent in the percolation situation is 1.22.
Yes, I've read I've glanced at their paper, but it seems that this 1.22 appears in quite a lot of situations.
Yes. So, but the question is it the same exponent, or is it in different disguises, or
that's the question.
Yes.
I don't see, when I read it, I didn't see a clear correspondence between that and what we are doing here.
Not obvious at all.
You can also have this exponent when you see fractures in correlated media, for example. You have this same scaling. I'm sure it has to do with the fact that we're looking at an optimal path somehow. How this is equivalent, maybe it is, but I don't see it.
You first. I have so many questions here.
So, forgive me, I'm a bit stupid, but I think that it looks very similar to a two-phase flow problem, like where you have this transition towards the Darcy scale. Isn't this just not just, that's not a value expression, but is it not the same, but just a continuous description of a two-phase flow problem?
When we first formulated this problem, we thought about the two-phase flow, but not exactly in what you might be envisioning. Is the fact that if you have a non-wetting phase that is blocked, that is lodged inside the larger pore when performing division, and then you can approximate it as a percolation process, where the bonds are randomly occupied, but I'm not sure exactly if it be the same. Yes.
I think I can start thinking about that. Well, the big difference is that in the two-phase problem, you depend on having actually an interface in a link for it to behave in that way. And you're going to have lots of links that just have one liquid in them.
Yes.
That's the big difference between
But you don't have interfaces here.
Yeah, you don't have the surfaces. Surfaces, in this case here, every single bond has this threshold in it.
Yes.
Yeah. So in that sense, what you're doing now, you're cutting links right at random, and then they're gone out of the problem. You have a percolation, but you sort of think of this also as a two-phase problem, as an inverted version of this one, because you have lots of links which don't have any interfaces in them. And they want to percolate also if you have the right ratio. But then, of course, it's either something with a threshold in it or no threshold, which is a different percolation problem. But, it's sort of interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Another problem and that difference is in two-phase flow, when things are moving,
Yeah.
they're changing with time. The interfaces are moving.
No, yes,
But here it's not changing.
They're not changing. So that's a frozen end disorder. And in that case here, you have an yield disorder because the interfaces are not actually moving. But there are deep connections between the problems.
But if you rather look at the flow problem, not the fixed pressure, but the fixed rate, you are maybe a bit closer to it, right? Because then you also have bubbles sort of hinging and have blocking, and then they start moving here.
And the question is maybe also if you increase that, so you go faster to this second regime, if you would get, if you would explore that limit, if you would get those circulations like that most like periodicity. Maybe we just don't see.
It was the flow rate, you mean?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Sorry.
It could be that you're just never see them because you're not close to that region where you actually would be able to see.
Just one question again about the situation where I assume that you always assume that the flows are incompressible, right? So you have mass conservation, incompressible flow. Now suppose that you start with a pressure that is some distance away from the percolation threshold and you lower it instantly. Is then instantly in this model the flow going down, or is there actually a dynamic? So there's a decay time from the original flow to the final model?
Oh, no, everything is static.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought.
A quick question here. So at any time you have like links that are flowing and links that are not flowing. And the links that, if I understood right, the links that are not flowing are either because the local yield threshold was not met or because the links were removed, right?
Yes, exactly.
So what's the experimental analog of removing the links? Is there any?
Well, we could, for example, consider like I previously mentioned that you have a non-wetting fluid that gets lodged inside the porous medium, and that it can block the access of the other phase, the least stress fluid, to flow. but it would require that the pressure drop is low enough that the capillary forces keep the non-magnetic phase in place. I'm not sure exactly if we could. I do not know. We have not thought about really the experimental validation of such a calculation on top of the pore network model. No.
So in single phase flow, the situation is more like all the links are in principle available, but then you just flow through the ones that have yielded the threshold, right? The local threshold.
Yes. Mm. Yes.
When cutting these links, so you have these three regimes of very low flow rates, the nonlinear regime, and the Darcy. So did I get it right that when you start cutting these links and start approaching the percolation threshold, that essentially the nonlinear regime disappears?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So it completely disappears. Or is it?
If you really look for it, you can find a small bump because, of course, there are still available paths. At the percolation threshold, the only path you can go through are within the percolating cluster.
Yeah.
And you still can have some new paths going there. And if you look at the snapshots of simulations, you see that there are still paths flowing, but they are very restricted to this percolating cluster.
Yeah.
So you can see it. Because what I plotted here highlights that. Here we just plot the flow rate with as a function of epsilon, but you see that this bump is very barely visible.
Yeah. Okay. So the disappearance of this bump is.
But if you plot Q over epsilon, you can see it better. Right? You can see the difference here. You could say this is an intermediate regime. But it not really doesn't have a very clear power exponent. And if you plot the same thing but with without cutting links, this part gets squished out because it's barely significant. So. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay. I think. Are there any more questions from Oslo or from the Zoom? Not. I think we can